Hello, and it's episode 125 of the Notcast, and it's been a week and a half since I last did one of these. I normally do one every few days, but I went on holiday. Well, I didn't go on holiday so much as we had guests, and I'd rather spend time with human beings rather than talk to my phone. So I spent some time in the so-called real world, and let me tell you, it was horrific and windy and wet, and that is a British summer all in one. I was originally going to talk about Depeche Mode's 1984 album, Some Great Rewards, but something happened this week, and I thought rather than talk about music that came out 40 years ago, I'm going to talk about music that came out about 48 hours ago. And today I'm going to be talking about Guns N' Roses. The more astute of you will have noticed from the t-shirt that I'm wearing a Guns N' Roses t-shirt. I'm going to talk about their so-called new single that was released online this week. The single is called Absurd. Since there is no physical release of Absurd, let's just pretend that this 7-inch single of Chinese Democracy is the single of Absurd, because otherwise it's just a man talking to a phone and you guys have nothing to look at. I'm a huge Guns N' Roses fan, or more correctly, I am a fan of what Guns N' Roses used to be. I'm not a fan of what Guns N' Roses now are. And I really started to lose interest in the band when they brought the Chinese Democracy period to a close with the shows in Vegas in 2014. I think it's really important if you're into a band and you're in a band is to make music, release music, play music, and to be current and valid in what you do. Now, obviously, the fact that I like Kraftwerk means that I'm very cognizant of the fact that you don't know how, or you can't work out where you are unless you work out how you've got there, and you've got to remember the journey on the way. But at the same point, if you spend the whole of your life living in the past, it's really difficult to make any sense of what's going on now. I want the option of being able to hear new music by bands that I love. Even if I don't like it, I want the option to have listened to it and then said, not for me, as opposed to just sit there and constantly go, well, the last album that they released or the last new songs that they played were 30 years ago. With the many lineup changes that Guns N' Roses had during the recording of Chinese Democracy, the many years of waiting, and the many finished tracks that were recorded during the period, I thought they're working on a fantastic album. The album, of course, was Chinese Democracy. It's my favourite Guns N' Roses album. The lineup that made this record is my favourite Guns N' Roses lineup. And you might think, well, what about Slash and Duff and Gilby and Izzy and Matt and Stephen and the Horns and Teddy Zigzag Andreas and all these other people? Well, that's not a version of Guns N' Roses that particularly interests me, actually. I grew up in industrial suburban Birmingham in the 80s and the 90s. I have little interest in spandex wankers with hairspray talking about or writing songs about girls, motorbikes, alcohol and other things. And with Chinese Democracy, they kind of eclipsed their previous activity and did what I think is their best album. That probably makes me the only person in the world that thinks that Chinese Democracy is better than Appetite for Destruction. But I do. Chinese Democracy has more meaning to me than Appetite for Destruction. So when the lineup with Slash and Duff happened in 2016, I saw it for what it is. It was called the Not in This Lifetime tour, and it was a nostalgia tour. It was a touring museum to remind people of what Guns N' Roses once were 30 years previously, reformed like processed meat, playing very few songs that were less than a third of a century old. It's like watching your ex-wife squeezing into her wedding dress, which is fine as long as she breathes in and she never eats anything ever again, but it still is straining at the seams. You can't pretend that it's 1991 anymore, despite what the contents of my record collection tell you. And to pretend that nothing has happened is Absurd, which is the name of the latest Guns N' Roses song to be officially released. Absurd. And Absurd is probably in the bottom two Guns N' Roses original songs that have been released. And let's not forget what Absurd actually is. By the way, the worst Guns N' Roses song to have ever been released is One in a Million, because the lyrics are distasteful, to put it politely, you know. And Used to Love Her is also in my bottom three. Those are bad lyrics, and Absurd has some of the worst lyrics that I've ever heard by any band ever. And as you guys know, I'm a lyrics guy. I love words in songs. I love good words, and I love articulate, clever ideas. Absurd demonstrates none of that. I'm going to take apart the song's lyrics later, but firstly I'm going to talk about why Absurd is not a new Guns N' Roses song and why it should be treated with contempt, because frankly the move of releasing it and calling it a new Guns N' Roses song is contemptuous of the public, because Absurd is a song that was first performed at Rock in Rio. Las Vegas House of Blues, on the 1st of January 2001. So Absurd, the new Guns N' Roses single, is over 20 years old. The song has been recorded in the studio many times during the Chinese Democracy Sessions. There are several studio versions of the song recorded between 1999 and 2006 that are circulating amongst the fan base. They are subject to copyright strikes very quickly. I will not be sharing them, I'll only be talking about them. And the song was called Silkworms when it was first performed, and nothing about the song has changed in any substantial fashion in the past 20 years. So if we look at the last studio recording pre this version of the band that was released, and compare it to the waveform that we've got for the single version of Absurd, what you will see there is effectively two nearly identical waveforms. The song is within to half of a second, functionally identical in every way, shape or form. The one at the top is the 2006 version that has Bumblefoot guitar overdubs. The one at the bottom is the 2021 version, and as you can see, all they've really done in the past 15 years is thrown Slash into the studio for a day and then bumped up the decimal rating and compressed it and mastered it so it sounds really bad and really compressed and horrible and shit. Absurd is by no means the glorious return of Guns N' Roses. It is a reheated leftover from Chinese Democracy that was deemed not good enough to be released at the time. And there are a number of other songs which the band recorded which have not been released. So I can think of probably about 16 Guns N' Roses songs that were recorded during the Chinese Democracy Sessions that were recorded, that circulate, that also are considerably less rubbish than Silkworms. So for example, Hard School, which the band have rehearsed under the name Checkmate, Atlas Shrugged. There's also Me and My Elvis, PRL, Eye on You, Nothing, Perhaps, Zodiac, As It Begins, Mustache, Tonto, Real Doll, Devious Bastard, Oklahoma, State of Grace, Circus Maximus, Curly and Rebel. All of those songs, there are circulating studio recordings of Guns N' Roses performing them during the Chinese Democracy Sessions, and those songs have been mixed and recorded. Josh Frisch recorded the drums, then he left, then Brain recorded the drums, then Frank for Fonda Chucker Ferrara joined. He recorded drums as well. Obviously there was the original guitar lineup of Robin Fink and Paul Tobias that then turned into Buckethead, Robin Fink and Paul Tobias that then turned into Robin Fink, Buckethead and Richard Fortus that then turned into Buckethead leaving, Bumblefoot joining, DJ Ashba joining and leaving without recording it or without releasing a note of music or writing a song, as far as anyone can tell. Guns N' Roses have been through a lot of guitar players. They've written a lot of songs, and very few of them are anywhere near as bad as Silkworms or Absurd. And really, my suggestion to you is don't get excited about the release of Absurd. Absurd by Guns N' Roses is a reheated, remixed, re-recorded leftover from Chinese Democracy Sessions. It's also one of the worst songs that Guns N' Roses have ever released. There is no substantial difference between Absurd and the version of Silkworms that existed in 2006. The only differences that there are is that Slash has gone into the studio, he's added 2 guitar solos, some acoustic guitar in the bridge, and the track has been remixed so that everything is compressed and it sounds really, really loud and really squashy and badly produced. There is no difference. I mean, Brain plays drums on the studio version of Absurd, which was released this week. Brain left the band over 15 years ago. I doubt he's ever played music with Slash. I don't even know if Duff plays on the song. It sounds like Slash might play on the song, but Absurd is nothing more than a remix of a very, very old song that's over 20 years old, and it's awful. It is by no means the thunderous return that Guns N' Roses deserve, or Guns N' Roses fans deserve. Silkworms was a terrible song in 2001. It has not improved in any way, shape, or form. Um, and Guns N' Roses don't have that many songs. I think there are 78 Guns N' Roses songs, of which 18 at least are cover versions. And they're cover versions of obscure acts like Paul McCartney, the Beatles, AC/DC, Bob Dylan, Rolling Stones, The Damned, The Stooges, T-Rex, bands that nobody's ever heard of. And obviously, Guns are doing their best songs. So, it's not that far removed, really, to have Guns N' Roses release a cover version as a single of Bob Dylan's Knocking on Heaven's Door, because they're just not very good at writing songs. And it staggers me that Guns N' Roses have made such a poor harvest of songwriting last so long. There have been 5 studio LPs in the band's entire career. There's been 1 album of covers. Their set lists are 85% 30-year-old songs, the same 20 songs every night in the same place, in the same row. There's no invention, there's no originality. It's a touring museum to what they used to be, a nostalgia act with no currency. I'm really, really interested in hearing bands make music now. I'd be fascinated to hear what somebody with Axl Rose's talent would make now as a 59-year-old man, and go, right, I'm aging, I'm growing, I'm facing mortality, and what am I doing? I'm playing nothing but 30-year-old songs written from over half of my life ago. And Absurd is not, by any imagination, a good lyric. Listen, motherfuckers, to the song that should be heard. Back down in the gutter is more than you deserve. A screaming fucking banshee. You know that's what you are. Pussy full of maggots. Isn't that absurd? That is the first verse of Absurd. That's what Axl Rose wants to say to the world after 13 years of not releasing anything. And it's awful. I'd be embarrassed to write that as a 17-year-old, let alone a 59-year-old. And Axl was at least 38 when he wrote the lyrics to that. Or more correctly, at least no older than 38. They're awful words, and he has not changed a single word, a single intonation, or anything in the past 20 years since he's done that. It's just terrible. And then the second verse is pretty much a repeat of the first 4 lines of the first verse. And then the third verse is those same 4 lines repeated again. So effectively, you've got 8 lines in Absurd, and they're all juvenile, woman done me bad, wrong, terrible, awful, boo-hoo, bitch broke my heart kind of stuff. The only thing that's changed in any substantial way between Absurd and Silkworms is that the chorus has been changed, and the chorus was the line, "What should I do with a bitch like you?" which is not on the 2006 version, it's not on the 2021 single version. I was hoping to be more positive about new Guns N' Roses music. I have strong affection for what Guns N' Roses used to be. I rate the Chinese Democracy album very, very highly. I rate their other albums pretty highly as well. I think that we deserve better than being given a reheated, remixed 20-year-old track that's basically shit, because Absurd is terrible. There's no flair in that song. There's nothing that tells me that Guns N' Roses are back. There's nothing that tells me that there is anything about the song that could have happened, or only could have happened, in the past 20 years. It is a generic thump-along bit of misogynistic, semi-industrial shite, and thank God I haven't paid for it, because it is not worth anything. It is the worst Guns N' Roses song that has been released since 1988. I'm really disappointed. Actually, I was hoping that the new material from Guns N' Roses, with Slash and Duff back in the band for the first time in 30 years, the first new song with Slash and Duff would be as good as something on Use Your Illusion 2. Hopefully, as good as something off Appetite for Destruction. It's not even as good as the worst track on Chinese Democracy. It's not even a B side because there's no A side there. It's just a song, and it's a terrible, awful song with awful lyrics that are juvenile, childish, misogynistic, unarticulate. It's the kind of stuff that you write when you were 14 and you just got dumped by your first girlfriend and you were drunk and you were angry. No one else in the world understands, apart from Trent Reznor, what it is like to be angry with the woman that broke my heart. And yeah, come on, Axel, you're 59. Grow up, write better lyrics, and don't just serve up this slightly remixed, slightly re-recorded 20-year-old song that was no good then and it's no good now. I don't like to be annoyed about things, but I do want to talk about Absurd. Absurd is an absurd song. There is no redeeming features about it whatsoever. It is lazy, it is crass, it is stupid, it's terrible, and it's a short one because I'm only talking about one song. Um, it's but it's today, but it's a cynical reheating of stale leftovers that weren't good enough 20 years ago. They're not good enough now. And for God's sake, Guns N' Roses deserve better than that. They really do. I've been listening to this song when it's been called Silkworms for over 20 years. I haven't listened to it often because it's not very good. When a band releases its first new material in 13 years, and its first material with the classic guitarist and bass player in 30 years, that song should pin you back to your seat. Like, the skeleton in the 80s advert about Maxell re-record, not fade away, and it's like they're going, blown away by how good this sound is. I heard Absurd, and I was just like, I have no desire to ever hear that song ever again. So it's not really a comeback single, it's more of a come down single. And if it is the best thing that the band can release from their new album, which inevitably will be at least half 20-year-old songs that didn't fit onto Chinese Democracy, remixed with Slash guitar solos, if that is the best thing that they can release, I can completely understand why Axl hasn't released anything, because this song is bollocks. I don't like to swear, but it's awful. It's really bad. And, it makes me pine for the days when the songs on Chinese Democracy only existed in my head and on live bootleg tapes because I had the promise of something amazing. There is not a song on Chinese Democracy that is worse than the new Guns N' Roses single. It is a crushing disappointment, a fatuous, childish letdown, and an awful song that frankly isn't worth what I paid for it, and I paid nothing. So there you go. Now, if you're going to be watching this and thinking, maybe I should write better songs, maybe you should just write songs, Axel. Right? You appear to be creatively constipated, and you've got no evidence that you've written any songs in the past 15, 16 years. Now, when that happened to Henry Rollins, he rang up his accountant and he went, I'm not going to write another song. I'm done. I'm finished. I have to end the band and I have to do something else. Be honest about it, as opposed to dragging your old asses around the world playing 1987 music at 2087 prices and charging us a fortune to remind you of how good you were 30 years ago. Just don't bother, okay? Write great songs. It's not as hard as you might think. You can do it. Just write great songs and then release them. Because if you can write a song as good as Madagascar, as good as There Was a Time, better, if you can do that, you can literally write any song that is better than Absurd. Hell, I will give you songs I've written. I've written at least 400 songs better than Absurd. I just can't sing them very well. It's a shit song, and I'm incredibly disappointed because all that's happened is that they've remixed a 2006 demo. They've added some guitars from Slash, and they've stuck it out. It wasn't worth the wait. Right, and that's 20 minutes about a 3-minute song, and that's probably 21 minutes more than that song deserves. I will do another episode, hopefully about older music that's considerably better at some point soon. But in the meantime, I haven't gone away. I just was going to do one about Depeche Mode, and then Guns N' Roses released the second worst song of their career as their comeback single. And instead of an amazing return, it was a damn squib that, frankly, I wish it hadn't been released. Chinese Democracy is an incredible album. It's my favourite Guns N' Roses album. I think it's really, really good. I really want to hear amazing, fantastic music that can only be made by the band that exists now at this age, growing old through time. I'm really interested to hear the creative work that a 50-something Axl Rose and his band would make. There's so much promise and so much potential inside Chinese Democracy. It completely blew open, the ideas of what rock would be. And instead, you've gone back and you've released a sexist piece of trash that wasn't good enough 20 years ago. It's not good enough now. So, next one, I'm going to be talking about probably Depeche Mode's Some Great Rewards album. I will be considerably more complimentary to the album by Depeche Mode than I have to the single by Guns N' Roses, because Absurd is terrible, and Some Great Rewards by Depeche Mode most definitely is not terrible. It's not the perfect album, but even the silences between the songs on the Depeche Mode album are better than the whole of that Guns N' Roses song, which came out this week. Right. I think there's only so many ways I can say that song, thumbs down. If it was in a Roman gladiatorial contest, I would now feed this song to the lions while the crowd bays for blood. But since we're not, I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to go and have some dinner. Take care of yourselves. Stay lovely. I will return with more positive conversation about better bands that have made better albums and better records than Guns N' Roses Absurd, because Guns N' Roses Absurd is awful, in case you hadn't already worked that out. Right, thank you. See you later. Bye.